Fraser, welcome back and thanks for staying with us here on Morning Live. And staying with stories dominating the headlines this week, the ANC's National Working Committee has commended the decision by President Cyril Ramaphosa to voluntarily present himself to the ANC's Integrity Commission. Now, this follows allegations that the president covered up a robbery at his Phala Phala farm in Limpopo, which is said to have taken place 2 years ago. Last week, former spy boss Arthur Fraser opened a case against the president for failing to report the burglary. Meanwhile, in separate developments, the Department of Justice has confirmed the arrest of alleged state capture kingpins, brothers Atul and Rajesh Gupta in Dubai. And the arrests come 4 months after Interpol issued a red notice for them in connection with fraud and money laundering charges. Now, they are implicated in hundreds of millions of rands in corrupt deals in Eskom and Transnet, among others. So to help us unpack some of these developments, we're joined by political analyst Aubrey Matshiqi. Gogo, thanks so much for your time and welcome to Morning Live. So this is the week where the cycle is just giving and giving. But let's start with the Guptas and their arrest. Firstly, what do you make of that in the current context?
Well, what we must remember, Sakina, is that at the commencement of the Zondo Commission, the Guptas made a request to testify via a video link, which request was rejected by the commission, which means the commission and the country did not have the benefit of the testimony of the Guptas. Well, even if it's going to take months before they are successfully extradited, at least we are getting closer to the moment when we will hear their side of the story and the role they did or did not play in what we call state capture.
So this, of course, has many South Africans euphoric this morning or last night when that news broke, feeling that perhaps there will be justice in the end for at least answering some of the questions that have been raised around state capture.
Well, their excitement is not unjustified. But we must temper our expectations with an air of reality. The Guptas will challenge the attempt to extradite them. But as we have seen over the years, the wheels of justice move quite slowly, and this matter will be no exception in that regard.
So it's one thing extraditing the Guptas, it's quite another to actually hold them accountable successfully. What is your view in that regard, given that the NPA at times have struggled with some high-profile cases, as quite a few come to mind. But of course, you have a state capture, there was a parliamentary inquiry, and a lot of evidence currently in the public domain around the alleged dealings of the Gupta brothers.
Well, you will remember, Sakina, that we went to watch a movie. Let's call it a James Bond movie. What effectively happened, because the Guptas did not testify and former President Jacob Zuma did not testify, is that the main character, James Bond, was not in the movie, and the arch villain was also not in the movie. So what we hope is that with their extradition, the possibility will be closer for the NPA to lay charges, prosecute them, and if they are guilty of the allegations and crimes of which they are accused, even convict them. But Sakina, my worry about this matter and other matters related to the Zondo Commission, and also the allegations being made against the president is this, that when the NPA is accused of doing the right thing or accused of doing the wrong thing, it is because of the same reason. In my own view, what we have seen over the past 2 decades is that we have a prosecutorial authority that tends to anticipate the wishes of those in power. When it acts or does not act, My suspicion sometimes is that it does so because it has anticipated the wishes of those in power. Therefore, even in this matter, what it will or will not do will probably be governed by that.
So just given all the evidence that we have seen and heard regarding the involvement of the Gupta brothers in the allegations of state capture, with that on the table, do you think that the NPA have a winnable case against the brothers at this stage?
Well, there is what we know, and there is always a difference between what you know and what you can prove. There is also the testimony that was led at the Zondo Commission. Now, it's inconceivable that all of the testimony that was led will help the NPA turn such testimony into evidence on the basis of which it will not only prosecute but will also convict. There is an extent to which some of the testimony that has been led will not help the NPA deliver prosecutions and convictions. One hopes, of course, that if there is any veracity in the claims that have been made against the Guptas as the arch-villains allegedly, such evidence against them can be turned into something the NPA can use to prosecute and convict.
So you have that coming out, but before that, the president's travails, and there have been many. There's a lot of talk in the last week about Glencore, the president's involvement with Glencore, and then, of course, the news about the burglary at the president's farm. And this is, of course, what the nation is seized with. But none of this is happening in a vacuum, Aubrey. So perhaps we do well by maybe establishing the context within which all of this is playing out.
Well, I can spend hours, Sakina, talking about the context in which this is happening. This is happening in part because the president, the man, Cyril Ramaphosa, is a construct to some extent. We have constructed, to some extent with the help of certain sections of the media, this angel of South African politics. And what we're struggling to do now is to bridge the gap between reality and the construct. Now, of course, because news is socially constructed, news is also politically constructed. And because it is politically constructed, that has helped Ramaphosa to the extent that invariably he tends to face what I call sweetheart conversations with the media. And so far, he has been able to giggle himself out of every corner. The question is whether this time he will be able to giggle himself out of the current allegations he is facing. But the problem we're facing is that we have created this construct. And this construct is causing a problem because, to some extent, it seems to be deviating from what it is really, from what it is really. In other words, it is deviating from the imperative of narrowing instead of widening the gap between the construct and reality.
So if we look at what is happening at the moment, and there seems to be consensus that the president has quite a bit to answer to with regard to that burglary that took place on his farm. But what are the questions, do you believe, the pertinent questions that the president needs to answer here?
Well, before we come to the pertinent questions, and as a follow-up to the statement I've just made, we must bear in mind that there's a very important dimension of the context you ask about. We are in a political universe of deception and counter-deception. And as we try to make sense of the allegations against the president, we will also have to make sense to what extent we're being exposed or subjected to deception or counter-deception. Another thing we must remember is that it is always unwise for a head of state anywhere in the world to pick a fight with the former head of intelligence, the former head of the revenue services, or the former chief of the army. This he must do because he must not do because the former head of intelligence, I assume, almost always has more information about the president than the president himself. In other words, a former head of intelligence tends to know more about the head of state than the head of state knows about himself or herself. Because an assumption, I assume, is made in the intelligence environment is that one of the primary threats to state and national security is the head of state himself. And that is why, for instance, Sakina, because Arthur Fraser says he has handed over footage to the police, if I were advising the president, is that in whatever he says in response, he must not assume that all the footage that has been handed over to the police, first of all, constitute the totality of the footage that is available about what happened or did not happen. And this I say because government will provide security to a head of state, a certain number of cameras, but you cannot assume, Sakina, that those cameras constitute the totality of cameras that are available. In other words, when he responds to this, he must assume there may have been other cameras in his property that were not privy to his security detail.
So, where does this leave the president? What can he do? Because on the other hand, the ATM has now written to the Speaker of the National Assembly and thereby essentially requesting a parliamentary inquiry as well. So you have a criminal case being opened with the South African Police Services by the former head of intelligence, Arthur Fraser, and now the parliamentary inquiry. It's becoming very difficult for the president to maneuver here, it would seem.
It is because every time he opens his mouth or his spokesperson speaks or the presidency issues a statement, the matter is not quashed. What happens instead is that more questions arise. And therefore, if, to use an analogy, the president is digging a hole, he is digging himself deeper into a hole, at least on the basis of what he has said so far. Because what he has said so far has not served him well. What it has done is to raise more questions about him. And what must bear in mind, Sakina, people think what will or may cause his political demise is a prosecution or a conviction. No. Politically, that's not how matters work. How matters work is the extent to which perceptions about him become negative, so negative they can be weaponized against him to deliver political conditions to his disadvantage, which conditions themselves deliver his political demise. So what I'm saying is that if in the mind of the citizen, his answers to the questions that are being raised are less than satisfactory, he may find himself facing the conundrum of other heads of state that they've faced in the past elsewhere in the world. Because another thing we must bear in mind, Sakina, is that if President Ramaphosa was the head of state of one of the democracies South Africa mimics, he would be under serious pressure to resign, or would have resigned by now. Also, what you must bear in mind is that every time he fails to give satisfactory answers, he weaponizes his answers to the advantage of his opponents and enemies inside the ANC. We are operating in the context of an upcoming policy conference, in the context of an upcoming national conference in December. Now, while my baseline scenario is that Ramaphosa is the front runner and may be destined to be elected for a second term as ANC president, this situation and others that may arise to his disadvantage may even raise questions about whether he can survive the upcoming policy conference, let alone the national conference in December.
So to that point, why wouldn't he survive? Because by all indications, it would seem from at least the provincial conferences that we've seen so far, that it is those who are in his camp, so to speak, who are emerging victorious. It seems to be a procession at this point for the president. So what would be the factors that would scupper that?
Well, let's go back to recent history. Mid-June 2005, former President Thabo Mbeki fires Jacob Zuma as the deputy president of the country. At the time, the position of former President Thabo Mbeki inside the ANC and in the state seemed unassailable, and Jacob Zuma was dead and buried. We all know what happened subsequently. What happened subsequently is that at the end of June, at the NGC of the ANC, the rebellion against former President Thabo Mbeki was launched. And therefore, what I'm saying is that as we saw with Jacob Zuma in February 2018, there comes a time when members of the ANC choose between the interests of the leader and the interests of the party or their own interests. And if the interests of the leader remain properly aligned with theirs, as they did with Jacob Zuma during the so-called 9 wasted years, they will continue to form a scrum in his defense. But if there ever comes a point when the allegations are so sharp that they must choose between their own survival as individual politicians and the survival of the president of the party and the president of the country, they will choose the former.
So we are out of time, Aubrey. Just the final question. As you invoke that 2005 scenario in the lead up to the Polokwane conference in 2007, Jacob Zuma emerged as the candidate to go up against the incumbent President Mbeki. Who would go up against Cyril Ramaphosa here?
I must repeat, Sakina, but it is until further notice, depending on the direction all these matters will take. It is still my baseline scenario that the next president of the ANC is Cyril Ramaphosa. We have seen whisperings and heard whisperings about people such as Lindiwe Sisulu. I don't think she's the next president of the ANC. People have argued in the past that according to a non-existent ANC tradition, the deputy president of the party automatically becomes the president of the party, in which case Didi Mabuza should benefit. But to me, the most important race will be the race for the deputy president of the party. And here you are beginning to hear names of people such as the Justice Minister Lamola, Paul Mashatile, and so on. But if we go back to the presidency, we must not undermine the potential of former Health Minister, Dr. Mkhize, becoming one of the key challengers to the throne.
Well, we leave it there because we know some of the difficulties he faces currently, but of course a story for another day. Gogo Aubrey Matshiqi, thanks so much for your time this morning. And that was political analyst Gogo Aubrey Matshiqi talking to us there about a variety of topics that have made the headlines this week. Time